What's the matter, George? Are the Hollywood roles getting a little hard to come by as you age and get decidedly more smug and self-congratulatory? I'm just asking. And chooses to finish this show by lecturing the audience on how journalism ought to be done. Speaking as Edward R. Murrow, he warns about the ongoing struggle for truth and integrity in the media. Truth and integrity. About the potential for the media to be manipulated and used for propaganda.
George Clooney is making headlines again. Shockingly, not for a gripping performance, a directorial masterpiece, or, heaven forbid, something that actually benefits society. No, this time the man who once portrayed Batman with all the gravitas of a runway model mourning at a black tie gala has re-entered the political arena. Because clearly, when the world cries out for nuanced geopolitical analysis, what we're really missing is the perspective of the guy who sells espresso with a smirk and a designer suit.
Wow, if that's Clooney with makeup. Imagine what he looks like without it, huh? Now remember, Clooney's the same guy who held a star-studded fundraiser for Joe weeks before he dropped out and only called for him to quit after his disastrous debate. Clooney ignored concerns over Biden's age for years, only to magically come to the conclusion that he was demented when America finally saw what Clooney had been hiding. That's the problem with Dems. They're obedient shills for awful people, then pretend otherwise once voters see that they're full of. But remember, we were pointing out Joe's dementia before it was cool. We knew Biden was the worst president ever, which probably means Jimmy Carter died a happy.
Ah yes, George, I'm too handsome to be wrong. Clooney graced us with yet another dazzling display of celebrity self-delusion, gliding into the public discourse like a silver-tongued oracle, as if charisma alone grants wisdom. But it didn't take long for reality to put him in a headlock. Enter Megyn Kelly and Greg Gutfeld, who delivered the rhetorical equivalent of a steel chair to the ego. Turns out, having a jawline sculpted by the gods doesn't mean your opinions land any smarter. By the end of it, Clooney looked less like a thought leader and more like the next face of ultra-soft tissues.
We check in with the poor man's Greg Gutfeld, George Clooney. Remember, he wrote a scathing op-ed prior to the election calling on Joe Biden to drop out? And this week, he took to CNN, the only place he's seen less than in his own movies, to gloat. God, I hope Jake Tapper doesn't plant his lips firmly on George's puckered ass.
This is the same guy who delivers heartfelt lectures to middle America, broadcast straight from his $100 million villa on Lake Como, where the biggest hardship is running out of imported sparkling water. Clooney, the man who probably hasn't set foot in a Walmart since ER was topping ratings, now claims to understand the daily grind of the average American, because nothing says man of the people quite like flying private to scold farmers about their carbon footprint. At this rate, don't be surprised if his next public service announcement involves flossing techniques, broadcast live from a yacht carved out of ethically sourced pearls.
Roberts, who outed herself not only as a leftist, which we knew, but as somebody who, and by the way, she's also a husband stealer. She stole the husband that she has right now in a reported affair. So, okay, maybe don't be the voice of the ad in which we talk about women betraying their husbands, because in the leftist view, marriages are not about honesty and talking about one's differences and agreeing to disagree on certain dicey issues, but they're about lying. And they believe this so strongly, you put it in an ad. And her pal, George Clooney, who did something similar for another ad, same. You got Joe Biden out. How'd it work out for you? How'd that go? Maybe you should have said something a little earlier, like when you attended that fun.
Clooney's stumble here wasn't just political, it felt practically cosmic, like the universe had finally decided it was done tolerating his curated charm offensive. After all, there's only so many times you can flash that signature smirk and deliver a speech dripping in self-importance before karma shows up with a mic drop. And this time, it came gift-wrapped in razor-sharp sarcasm and plated with a generous helping of public embarrassment. Think less red carpet, more reality. Check, served cold.
It's a long time, but he should have the guts to maybe say that his friends in Hollywood, like John Boyd or Mel Gibson or Sylvester Stallone, who shared a risk, might have been right on a few things. He's starring in Glengarry Glen Ross, am I right?
No, it's Good Night and Good Luck.
Oh,
sorry,
never mind.
My fault.
I was going to say, I mean, they have tremendous respect for David Mamet. David Mamet is one of the most conservative people. So maybe instead of just sitting in silence, you should actually speak up for some of the people who shared the risk.
Let's be honest. Clooney's entire foray into politics feels less like conviction and more like high-budget cosplay of moral superiority. He drifts into the conversation like a cinematic messiah, blinks those perfectly moisturized eyes, and expects the world to freeze mid-thought. Why? Because he once played a doctor on TV. Forget credentials, data, or even basic logic. George feels the truth in his soul, and if you don't immediately nod along, well, clearly you're just a barbarian with no appreciation for espresso and designer activism. What made this particular implosion so satisfyingly theatrical wasn't just the message, it was Clooney's rock-solid belief that he'd stroll in, deliver his smug little sermon, and cue thunderous applause as if he were cradling an Oscar under warm stage lights. Instead, he walked straight into a rhetorical buzzsaw. The crowd didn't swoon. They swung back, hard. No one was impressed by his dimples or dulled by his reheated monologues. Watching Clooney get intellectually pancaked was like watching a luxury Rolex enter a demolition derby. Polished, pricey, and painfully out of its depth. It was glitz versus grit. And spoiler alert, the glitter didn't survive.
Where he saw Biden almost falling off the stage, where Obama came out to grab him, was June 15th. The debate was June 27th. It wasn't until July 10th, almost a month after he attended the fundraiser with him, that George Clooney finally wrote that op-ed after it became clear that Joe Biden wasn't stepping down. He's such a liar that he just encountered him at the debate and knew.
His reaction? Oh, it was peak Clooney. Furrowed brow, wounded pride, and that signature look of disoriented disbelief, as if it simply hadn't occurred to him that anyone, anywhere, might not see him as the human embodiment of moral virtue and Oscar-worthy gravitas. He wore the confusion like a cashmere cloak, radiating the same energy as a substitute teacher realizing his vintage sweater vest and edgy VHS tapes aren't exactly winning over the class. In that moment, the man who clearly thought he must was Zeus descending from Mount Olympus found himself getting verbally posterized, like a junior varsity mascot caught mid-cartwheel by a pro dunk. And let's not skip over his delivery style. Clooney doesn't debate. He performs. Every line is soaked in breathy sincerity, as if he's narrating a tragic documentary about endangered butterflies. He could be talking about zoning laws, and you'd swear he was mourning the fall of the Roman Empire. His cadence drips with theatrical gravitas, punctuated by dramatic pauses and that ever-present head tilt, like he's perpetually caught mid-glance in a black and white cologne ad. It's less conversation, more interpretive monologue.
You know, he's the opposite of radical. But the weird thing is, without a horse to back, do you really know what he believes in? Like, I know what he's against. He's against Trump. But in this new world of common sense, what is he aligned with? He might have way more in common with Trump than he is with the progressives. The question is, does he have the bravery to say that? I have no idea where he stands on the border, sanctuary cities, or trans extremism. How does he feel about the fires in LA? Is he happy with how it was handled by Mayor What's-Her-Face and Governor who's his name?
But the moment someone like Greg Gutfeld throws a well-aimed verbal elbow, Clooney's entire performance starts to unravel. That Hollywood halo he's worn so effortlessly, it flickers out faster than a stage light during a power outage. Suddenly, he's not the enlightened celebrity savior. He's just another famous guy who confused applause with authority. Spoiler alert, having a fan base doesn't make you infallible. And then came Megyn Kelly, slicing through his talking points with the elegance of a surgeon and the impact of a chainsaw. Every drop of Clooney's carefully cultivated sanctimony began to evaporate, leaving behind nothing but a puddle of bruised ego and misplaced confidence. He walked in expecting to give a TED Talk on truth and justice. What he got instead was a front row seat to his own rhetorical takedown, roast style. There's something oddly satisfying about watching a man who hasn't heard the word no, since dial-up internet was still a thing, get absolutely steamrolled in real time. Clooney's adult life has been one long highlight reel of people calling him brilliant, bold, and breathtaking, mostly while angling for a seat at his next lake. Como soiree. But this time, someone finally said it. His political insights have all the depth of a kiddie pool in peak drought season.
is going on, this is to 60 last night, about, you mentioned his op-ed in the New York Times on Joe Biden and why he did it. Such a selfless, brave act, Ben. Here he was.
I was raised to tell the truth. I had seen the president up close for this fundraiser, and I was surprised. And so I feel as if there was a lot of profiles in cowardice in my party through all of that.
Oh, wow.
And
You could practically hear his publicist screaming into a throw pillow, clutching a half-drained bottle of Merlot like it was a sacred relic. Somewhere in Beverly Hills, a crisis team of well-moisturized PR interns was lighting scented candles and chanting "Serenity Now," while feverishly Googling emergency damage control for delusional A-listers. Meanwhile, Clooney sat blinking into the camera like someone had just unplugged his teleprompter, visibly stunned that his chiseled jawline hadn't magically erased the cringe that had just tumbled out of his mouth. The man looked genuinely baffled that the crowd didn't melt into applause the moment he opened his perfectly moisturized lips. Instead, they listened. Worse, they processed. And what they heard? A soundbite so magnificently tone-deaf, it could have qualified for its own Bravo spin-off. This is what happens when someone confuses being photogenic with being prophetic. For years, Clooney has been treated like the human embodiment of a silk robe. Elegant, soothing, but ultimately useless outside very specific contexts. He enters a room, people stand, he furrows his brow, and somewhere, a think tank drafts a position paper. The man could sneeze into a microphone and wake up to headlines dubbing him the conscience of our generation. But not this time. This time, the silk robe caught fire. So naturally, Clooney thought he could waltz into a nuanced political debate, drop a vague monologue that sounded like it was ghostwritten by a Hallmark card with a minor in Social Justice 101, and then moonwalk out to a standing ovation. Except instead of applause, he got metaphorically slapped with a cold, wet fish, right across that award-winning jawline. Turns out, feeling something deeply isn't quite the same as understanding it. His speech didn't land. It crash-landed, rolled, burst into flames, and then tried to sue the runway. Imagine Siri attempting to deliver a eulogy, but Siri's had 2 martinis and is holding a thesaurus she's clearly never opened. That's the energy Clooney brought to the conversation. And then there's the faux intellectualism. George Clooney talking about politics is like your cousin binge-watching The West Wing over a weekend and suddenly believing they're qualified to broker peace talks in the Middle East. He stringed together buzzwords he likely overheard between sips of champagne at a $10,000-a-plate fundraiser, tossed in a few gravelly-voiced head tilts for effect, and crowned himself the Socrates of Santa Monica. "We must come together," he declared, eyes moist with manufactured sincerity. Oh wow, truly. Revolutionary, George. Someone alert the United Nations immediately.
It's are breaking. Tara Palmieri, who's got her own Substack and podcast now, she's been on the show, she got a copy and released a couple of the nuggets, and so did The Guardian. But hers was a really interesting nugget. And she's apparently in this book, they reveal that George Clooney saw Morning Joe one day, right after his op-ed, and Mika Brzezinski was suggesting that Barack Obama was behind the George Clooney op-ed. That was basically making Clooney seem like Obama's puppet. Yeah. Here's the.
You can almost picture the campaign merch now. Tastefully distressed slogans etched into reclaimed wood, sold at boutique gift shops somewhere between the scented candles and ironic yoga mats. Clooney 2024. All vibes, no policy. He's less of a thought leader and more like what would happen if Pinterest became self-aware and started hosting TED Talks. Clooney's entire brand rests on the illusion of depth, like a motivational poster in a WeWork conference room. Lofty language, pretty fonts, and yet somehow absolutely zero substance. Scratch the glossy, espresso-scented veneer, and what lies beneath isn't wisdom. It's a man unraveling in real time because the universe, shockingly, didn't swoon at his charm. When the applause fades, the tuxedo stops being a symbol and becomes just an overpriced suit. And suddenly, the emperor isn't just naked, he's standing under the spotlight mid-sentence, slowly realizing the room's gone cold. The silence is no longer reverent, it's awkward. Watching him spiral was like watching a luxury candle try to hold its form in a wildfire. The more he tried to project calm nobility, the more transparent the internal panic became. It was the meltdown of the decade, an existential breakdown disguised as political concern. He looked moments away from calling Amal and begging her to draft a cease and desist for reality itself.
I think, this Johnny come lately, I was raised to be honest, is a bunch of BS. All right. Obama told him to do it. He sees himself as this extremely important person. I think he's an arrogant, condescending, smug individual who thinks that, he should be able to tell people in America and the Democrat Party, certainly, what they should and shouldn't do. This president, Joe Biden, is one of the most disastrous presidents that we've had.
You know it's going sideways when even fellow celebrities start slowly inching away, offering polite smiles while internally chanting, "Not my Clooney, not today." You can practically hear the group chats buzzing with panic. Did you see what George said? Bro, delete your account. It's giving flashbacks to that time he tried to explain crypto like it was a screenplay pitch, and somehow managed to confuse Bitcoin with frequent flyer miles. Let's be real. This isn't Clooney's first political fumble. The man's public activism history reads like a blooper reel. Lots of noble intention, minimal follow-through, and an overwhelming ratio of ego to impact. He jumps on causes like he's auditioning for Hamilton, the hashtag edition. All performance, no policy. But this time it hit differently. People didn't cheer. They didn't retweet his speech with misty-eyed captions or drop heart emojis like confetti. Instead, they raised their eyebrows, side-eyed their screens, and let the grown-ups take it from here. And for someone like Clooney, who spent decades being met with standing ovations for breathing in the general direction of a camera, that silence, that cold, echoing lack of applause, that's the real heartbreak. Because nothing rattles a man more than realizing the room stopped clapping and no one's waiting for his encore.
He and George get together and they start navel gazing on stage about themselves, of course, and their vaunted profession and how bad, how just terrible the media is, and had the following exchange.
What we do in this is we talk about the responsibility of journalists to hold truth to power, right? That's our goal. And so if you're doing that, and we don't tell people what to think when we show that montage at the end.
As the internet erupted with memes of Clooney glitching like a malfunctioning robot at a TEDx youth conference, his PR team scrambled into spin mode, desperately trying to rebrand the meltdown as a moment of emotional honesty. No, George, that wasn't vulnerability. That was public humiliation dressed in couture and cufflinks. You didn't share your truth. You got verbally dismantled by people who don't need cinematic lighting or a Hans Zimmer score to make a compelling point. Let's not get it twisted. Clooney will survive this. He'll retreat to his Lake Como villa, sip red wine that costs more than your monthly rent, and write it all off as a blip in his otherwise retouched existence. But that clip is forever. It's a digital scarlet letter, looped and memed into eternity. A glittering reminder that charm is not a substitute for substance, and charisma can't save you when logic walks into the room. And the best part? This entire beautiful disaster started because George assumed he was untouchable. He believed his smirk was a shield, his resume a force field. He walked into the arena thinking no one would dare challenge him. And then, they did.
George is trying to find a marquee name to front a dreadful remake of Heaven's Gates. And I don't mean...
He really thought he could just waltz into a complex conversation, toss out a few vaguely inspirational sound bites, and leave the room dazzled, like a motivational speaker in a tuxedo. But instead of applause, Clooney got dragged like a plastic lawn chair in a hurricane. His fan base is still frantically trying to spin it, clinging to his reputation like it's the final float in the Titanic-themed parade. He was brave to speak out, they cry, as if bravery means saying something half-baked and getting upset when people notice it's still raw in the middle. But here's the thing, bravery isn't opening your mouth and hoping it works out. Bravery is doing the work, reading, the room, reading a book, understanding the stakes. It's about showing up with substance, not just style. You don't get credit for tossing out reheated cliches like a human fortune cookie and calling it courage. This wasn't about politics. Not really. It wasn't left versus right, or liberal versus conservative. This was the tragicomic unraveling of a man who's been told for decades that he's the smartest, suavest, most devastatingly charming guy in every room. Only this time, the room didn't care. No one gasped at his people's sexiest man alive credentials. No one paused for a swoon. George didn't walk in as the leading man. He stumbled in like an understudy who forgot his lines and got politely ushered off stage with a, "Thanks, but we're going in another direction." It was like watching someone who's coasted on. Charm since the ER days suddenly realized that charisma doesn't come preloaded with insight. Clooney walked into this debate expecting a standing ovation and instead got a standing mic drop from people who weren't remotely impressed by the tux or the tousled hair. You could almost hear the universe chuckling, gently reminding him that gravitas isn't something you fake with an eyebrow raise and a slow, thoughtful nod. It's not found in an Oscar gift bag or stitched into the lapels of an Armani suit. Real gravitas is earned in the trenches, through sweat, study, missteps, and the kind of humility that doesn't fit into a monologue, and that's the brutal brilliance of it all. Clooney strolled into a serious conversation dressed in layers of self-assured delusion, only to find the crowd saw right through the tuxedo. It wasn't wisdom, it was wardrobe. The man who thought he was playing the hero learned in real time that he was cast as comic relief.